The courtroom hummed with low murmurs as Jamal Carter stood alone at the defendant's table. His suit, though clean, showed signs of wear, the fabric slightly faded from years of careful use. Across from him, Daniel Whitmore, the lead attorney for Crestwood Financial, sat with an air of confidence, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his smirk almost taunting. Judge Leonard Sinclair, seated high above them, let out a dry chuckle as he tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. "Representing yourself, Mr. Carter?" he mused, shaking his head slightly. "This should be entertaining." The courtroom echoed with a few quiet chuckles from the bank's legal team, their amusement evident, but Jamal didn't flinch. He locked eyes with the judge, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to entertain, Your Honor," he said. "I'm here to win." Could a man without a law degree truly expose corruption in open court? Could he stand against a system built to keep people like him powerless? Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe in fighting for justice, hit like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Jamal stood on the cracked front porch of his childhood home, the morning sun casting long shadows over the weathered wooden steps. The house, though modest, held a lifetime of memories. It had been in his family for 3 generations, more than just a structure of bricks and wood. It was history, the last tangible piece of his late mother's legacy. But today, his grip tightened around a piece of paper that threatened to erase it all. The eviction notice was stamped with bold red ink. Final notice, property to be vacated in 14 days. Jamal's breath caught as he read the words again. His throat tightened. His mother, Miriam Carter, had worked 2 jobs for nearly 30 years to keep this house. She had died believing it was secure, paid off, free and clear. So how could this be happening? Heart pounding, Jamal rushed inside. He tore open the old wooden file cabinet in the corner of the living room, papers spilling onto the floor. Mortgage statements, tax receipts, the original deed, everything was there, just as his mother had left it. Everything was in order, except for one thing. A document he had never seen before, labeled Second Mortgage Agreement. His eyes darted to the bottom of the page and his stomach turned. It bore his mother's signature. But something was wrong. The handwriting was shakier than her usual steady script. The letters slanted at an odd angle, unfamiliar and inconsistent. Jamal's gut twisted. His mother never took out a second mortgage. Someone had forged this document. His first call was to the bank. Sitting on hold for nearly 30 minutes, he tapped his foot anxiously, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Finally, a clipped, disinterested voice came through the receiver. "Foreclosure Department, Crestwood Financial. How can I assist you?" Jamal took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "I'm calling about an eviction notice for my mother's property. There's been a mistake. The mortgage was paid off. I have the deed in front of me." The woman on the other end sighed as if she had heard this 1,000 times before. "Sir, the account is in default due to non-payment on a second mortgage taken out 2 years ago. Foreclosure proceedings are final." Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. "That's impossible. My mother never took out a second mortgage." There was a pause. Then the woman's tone turned cold. "Mr. Carter, maybe you weren't aware of her financial situation." The insinuation hit like a slap. Jamal clenched his teeth. "I want copies of every document related to this loan." "File a request with our legal department," she replied coolly. "But it won't stop the eviction?" The line went dead. Jamal stared at the framed photo of his mother on the mantel, the one taken on the day she burned the original mortgage paperwork, celebrating freedom from debt. His jaw tightened. Someone was lying, and he was going to find out who. Fueled by determination, Jamal drove straight to the bank. Inside, he was met by Richard Hargrove, the branch manager. A middle-aged white man with a smug smile, Hargrove barely glanced at Jamal's paperwork before shaking his head. "People like you need to learn how the system works," Hargrove said, sliding the documents back across the desk. "If you're in default, you lose the house. End of story." Jamal leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "This signature on the second mortgage, it's not my mother's. Look closely." Hargrove's eyes flicked to the page, but his smirk didn't waver. Signatures change over time. People get desperate, make bad decisions. Maybe she didn't tell you. Jamal's fist clenched. She didn't take out this loan, and you know it. Hargrove's smirk hardened into a sneer. If you want to fight it, hire a lawyer. But you'd better act fast. You've got 2 weeks. Jamal left the bank, his blood boiling. Lawyers weren't an option. After losing his job due to corporate downsizing, he had been working part-time at Sunset Park Community Center, barely making enough to cover bills. There was no money for attorneys. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, eyes burning from hours of reading fine print. His phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa Brooks, his girlfriend. "How bad is it?" Jamal stared at the eviction notice, his jaw tightening. "Bad," he typed back, "but I'm not giving up." And he meant it. No bank, no corrupt system was going to take what his mother had worked her whole life to protect. If they thought he was just going to walk away quietly, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jamal Carter sat across from Richard Hargrove, the smug-faced branch manager of Crestwood Financial, his jaw tight with controlled fury. Hargrove barely glanced at the stack of documents Jamal had brought before shaking his head dismissively. "People like you need to learn how the system works," Hargrove said, sliding the papers back across the desk. His tone was thick with condescension, his smirk unwavering. "If you're in default, you lose the house. End of story." Jamal leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "This signature on the second mortgage, it's not my mother's. Look closely." Hargrove's gaze flicked to the document for a brief second, but he only chuckled, his smirk deepening. Signatures change over time. People get desperate, make bad decisions. Maybe she didn't tell you. Jamal's fingers curled into a fist beneath the desk. "She didn't take out this loan, and you know it." The branch manager sighed dramatically, as if Jamal was a nuisance he couldn't wait to be rid of. "If you want to fight it, hire a lawyer, but you'd better act fast. You've got 2 weeks." The words landed like a hammer blow, but Jamal refused to let it show. Instead, he stood, collected his papers, and walked out of the bank, his blood boiling. A lawyer wasn't an option. Since losing his job as a social worker during corporate downsizing, he had been working part-time as a janitor at Sunset Park Community Center, barely making enough to cover basic necessities. There was no money for legal fees. That night, sitting at his mother's old kitchen table, Jamal spread out every document he had. Mortgage statements, tax receipts, the original deed, everything. His eyes burned from reading fine print for hours, searching for anything that might prove the fraud. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa Brooks, his girlfriend. "How bad is it?" Jamal exhaled sharply and typed back, "Bad, but I'm not giving up." The next morning, Jamal visited the local legal aid office, but the receptionist barely glanced at his paperwork before shaking her head. "We're at capacity. Try private counsel." Jamal did, firm after firm, only to be turned down again and again. Some cited workload issues, others claimed conflicts of interest, but a few were more blunt. "We don't take cases we can't win." By the time he got home that evening, a white notice was taped to his front door. "Sheriff's eviction scheduled. 10 days from today." Jamal's chest tightened. They were moving fast. Too fast. It wasn't just about the money, they wanted him gone. Desperate for options, he attended a town hall meeting that evening, hoping to speak with Councilman Brent Holloway, a white politician known for his community outreach. When Jamal finally managed to corner him after the meeting, Holloway smiled tightly, his expression carefully rehearsed. "I sympathize with your situation," Holloway said, patting Jamal's shoulder like one would console a child. "But the bank followed procedure. The best thing you can do is find alternative housing." Jamal's stomach twisted. "Alternative housing?" His voice sharpened. "This isn't just a house. It's my family's history." Holloway's smile faded. His voice grew colder. "History doesn't pay the bills, son." The word son hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Jamal stepped back, rage tightening his chest. They had already decided he didn't belong. The eviction wasn't just about money, it was about power. Erasure. He left the town hall feeling defeated but not broken. Sitting on the edge of his mother's old bed later that night, one thought crystallized in his mind. If they think I'm walking away quietly, they don't know who they're dealing with. A new plan? Jamal sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the eviction notice glaring back at him like a death sentence. His laptop hummed softly as he typed mortgage fraud cases into the search bar. Page after page of foreclosure horror stories filled the screen, families forced out due to paperwork errors, predatory loans, and more often than not, forged signatures. Then, one case stood out. Martin Vilas Horizon Bank, where a homeowner had successfully challenged foreclosure after proving the mortgage transfer was invalid. The key discovery? A formal request for all documents related to the loan. Jamal scribbled down notes. He needed help. But after being turned away by multiple attorneys, he knew this fight would be his alone. The next morning, he drove downtown to the courthouse with a folder filled with evidence. Inside, he waited nearly an hour before finally reaching the clerk's window. "I need to file a motion for a stay of eviction," Jamal said, sliding his paperwork across the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged white woman with sharp eyes, barely glanced at the forms before shaking her head. "Are you representing yourself?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Yes," she exhaled slowly. "You'd be better off finding an attorney. These cases don't usually end well for pro se defendants." "I don't have time for an attorney," Jamal replied, his jaw tightening. "Just file the motion." Reluctantly, she stamped the forms and handed him a copy. "The judge will review it, but don't get your hopes up." 2 days later, the court's response arrived. Motion denied. Jamal stood in the courthouse hallway, the rejection letter trembling in his hands. His heart pounded, dread settling in his chest. He had done everything right. Gathered evidence, filed paperwork, followed procedures. And still, the system slammed the door in his face. Fueled by frustration, he stormed back into Crestwood Financial, demanding to see the original loan documents. Hargrove sat behind his polished oak desk, sipping coffee like he hadn't just signed away Jamal's family legacy. "File a discovery request," Hargrove said lazily, adjusting his tie. "Otherwise, this conversation is over." Jamal's fists clenched. He needed a new strategy. That night at the community center, an elderly volunteer named Margaret Holloway, a woman who had lived through the civil rights movement, watched him quietly. "Baby, you look like the world is sitting on your shoulders," she finally said. Jamal sighed, leaning on the mop handle. "It kind of feels that way." She nodded thoughtfully. "My daddy always said, when they push you to the edge, you got two choices, fall or fight. But if you're going to fight, you'd best know their game better than they do." The law, Jamal didn't need a lawyer. He needed to become his own expert. That night, he cleared his kitchen table and spread out every document he had. He borrowed law books, printed foreclosure guidelines, and started highlighting, cross-referencing, and jotting down notes. He studied until his vision blurred. Then finally he found it, a single line in the foreclosure statute. All mortgage transfers must be accompanied by a valid endorsement from the previous lender. Jamal pulled the bank's filings and froze. The last transfer of his mother's mortgage lacked the required endorsement. Legally, the bank had no right to foreclose. Heart racing, he filed a new motion, this time requesting full discovery of all documents related to the mortgage. 2 days later, the court's response arrived. Motion for discovery. Granted. Jamal sat on the couch, the paper trembling in his hands. He had forced the system to acknowledge his fight, but the bank wouldn't go down quietly, and they were about to retaliate. The system strikes back. A fight for survival. Jamal Carter sat in his mother's empty kitchen. The only sound, the faint hum of the fridge. One of the few things still working. His utilities were still shut off, his bank account frozen, and his car repossessed. The system was retaliating, squeezing him, trying to choke him out. But they had made a mistake. The court's approval of his discovery request wasn't just a lifeline. It was a weapon, and he intended to wield it with precision. The next morning, Jamal walked into the Crestwood County Courthouse, his steps purposeful despite the exhaustion weighing him down. He approached the clerk's counter, sliding across his official discovery request. The documents demanded the original mortgage agreement, all transfer records, the notarized second mortgage papers. They claimed his mother had signed them. Now they had to prove it. The clerk, a younger black woman named Tasha Brown, glanced at the paperwork. A tired but knowing smile touched her lips. "Fighting the bank?" she asked quietly. Jamal nodded. "Every damn day." She exhaled and stamped the request. "Most people give up by now. Good luck." Jamal didn't believe in luck. This was survival. 3 days later, the bank responded, not with the documents, with a motion to dismiss his discovery request entirely, calling it overly broad and burdensome. Jamal read the filing twice, his frustration boiling over. They weren't even pretending to follow the rules. Without missing a beat, he drafted a counter-motion, citing case law he'd found in his sleepless nights of research. He hand-delivered it to the courthouse. That same afternoon, his phone rang. It was Judge Robert Whitmore's clerk. Judge Whitmore wants an in-person hearing to address the excessive nature of your discovery request. Jamal's stomach sank. He knew what that meant. The judge was giving the bank another chance to crush him. This time, in open court, a fight in the lion's den. 2 days later, Jamal stood before the bench, staring across at Jonathan Sinclair, the bank's top attorney. Sinclair was everything Jamal expected. Slick hair, tailored suit, a cold, calculated smile. Your Honor, Sinclair began smoothly, this request is nothing more than a fishing expedition. Mr. Carter is grasping at straws to delay an inevitable foreclosure. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, nodding lazily. Mr. Carter, why should I make the bank jump through hoops for you? Jamal stepped forward, holding up 2 copies of the mortgage agreement, the original and the one with the second mortgage. Because, Your Honor, the bank filed 2 versions of the same document. Look at the signatures, they don't match. Whitmore glanced at the papers, unimpressed. Signatures change over time. Jamal's voice sharpened. Not in 3 months. And not when that second signature was supposedly signed the day after my mother was hospitalized for a stroke. Silence fell over the courtroom. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. That got his attention. You're saying the bank falsified documents? I'm saying, Jamal replied, his voice steady, that without full discovery, we'll never know. If they have nothing to hide, they should have no problem providing the original paperwork. Sinclair's smirk faltered. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The foreclosure was executed according to standard procedure. Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temple. He hated being put in a position where he had to look impartial. Fine, he muttered. Discovery request stands. The bank has 7 days to produce the documents. Jamal's heart pounded as Whitmore banged the gavel. It wasn't a win, not yet, but it was a step forward. As he left the courtroom, his phone buzzed. It was Vanessa. Did you win? She asked anxiously. Jamal exhaled. Not a win, but they have to hand over the documents. There was a pause. And if they don't? Jamal stared at the courthouse doors. Then we'll know the fraud goes deeper than I thought. The system strikes back. Jamal didn't even get to wait the full 7 days. 3 days later, he pulled into a street after his night shift at the community center and saw 2 movers hauling his mother's old couch out of the front door. His stomach dropped. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, sprinting up the cracked concrete steps. A sheriff's deputy, a burly white man with mirrored sunglasses, stood by the curb, flipping through a clipboard. He barely glanced at Jamal. Eviction order, effective immediately. Jamal's chest tightened. That's not possible. The court granted a stay. The deputy shrugged, holding up a fresh order, signed by Judge Whitmore. Bank filed new evidence this morning. Foreclosure's final. Jamal snatched the paper, his hands shaking. The new evidence was a revised version of the mortgage transfer, complete with a notarized signature. A forgery, undoubtedly, but polished enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. He turned to the movers. Stop! That couch belonged to my grandmother. One of them scoffed. Not your house anymore, buddy. Across the street, a white neighbor leaned against his truck, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. Should have known better than to think you'd keep a place like this. Jamal's fists clenched. By nightfall, the house was stripped bare. His family's history, reduced to furniture on a curb. A war begins. Jamal sat on the front steps, his phone buzzing again. It was Vanessa. Where are you? She asked, her voice tight with worry. Home, he muttered bitterly, or what's left of it. Come stay with me. Jamal couldn't move. He stared at the empty doorway. The house was dark and lifeless. This wasn't just about a home anymore. This was war. They had rigged the system, forged documents, weaponized the courts, and gotten away with it. Until now. Jamal stood slowly, his determination hardening into something sharper. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. Because he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for justice, for his mother's legacy, for every person this system had crushed and discarded. Because if they could do this to him, they could do it to anyone. And Jamal Carter wasn't about to let that happen. Jamal Carter clenched his fists, jaw tightening, as he stared at the white officer smirking at him outside the courthouse. "I'm filing legal documents," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "That's what courthouses are for." The officer leaned against his patrol car, crossing his arms. Sure, just making sure you're not causing trouble. You know how it is." Jamal knew exactly how it was. It wasn't about trouble. It was about intimidation, about reminding him that the system wasn't designed for people like him to win. Saying nothing, Jamal turned and walked away, feeling the officer's eyes on him until he disappeared down the block. That evening, Jamal sat in the community center break room, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows against the peeling walls. Miss Holloway, the elderly volunteer who had once warned him to know their game, shuffled into the room. Her face creased with worry. "Baby, you look like you've been fighting the whole world," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Jamal forced a tired smile. "Feels that way." Miss Holloway reached out, squeezing his hand. "Well, don't let them beat you down," she said, her voice firm despite her age. "You got more fight in you than they ever counted on." Her words stayed with him long after he left the center, walking back to the small motel room he had scraped together enough money to rent. But even that fragile sense of safety didn't last, cut off at every turn. 2 days later, Jamal was sitting in a diner, reviewing his court filings over a cup of weak coffee when his phone buzzed. "Alert. Your bank account has been frozen due to suspicious activity." His stomach sank. Without access to his money, he couldn't pay for the motel, food, or even transportation. This wasn't a coincidence. The bank was tightening the noose. Desperate, he called the fraud department. The moment he heard the voice on the other end, his gut twisted. Darren Klein. "Mr. Carter," Klein drawled, sounding almost amused. "Looks like there's been some unusual activity on your account. Standard procedure to freeze it while we investigate." Jamal gritted his teeth. "What unusual activity?" Klein chuckled. "Hard to say. Might be all those legal filings. Funny how paperwork tends to stir up trouble." Jamal's hands shook with anger as he ended the call. This wasn't just about the house anymore. They were trying to destroy his life, piece by piece, until he had no choice but to walk away. That evening, things got worse. As Jamal stepped out of the motel lobby, 2 sheriff's deputies approached, hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Jamal Carter?" one asked, his eyes cold. Jamal's pulse spiked. "Yeah. Need you to come with us," the deputy said flatly. "You've been reported for trespassing on private property." Jamal blinked. "Trespassing? Where?" The deputy smirked. "Your old house. Neighbors said you were snooping around." "I haven't been near that house since they threw me out," Jamal snapped, frustration boiling over. "Tell it to the judge," the other deputy muttered, snapping handcuffs around Jamal's wrist before he could protest further. Hours later, Jamal sat in a holding cell, the sour stench of sweat and disinfectant burning his nose. He hadn't even been officially charged, just detained for questioning. The message was clear: back off or face real consequences. When they finally released him just before dawn, his phone was dead, his wallet nearly empty, and the motel had already locked him out for non-payment. Homeless, broke, exhausted. Jamal sat on a bench outside the station, head in his hands, but the fire inside him hadn't gone out. If anything, it burned hotter. They had frozen his money, taken his home, thrown him in a cell without cause. But they hadn't taken his mind, or his determination. By sunrise, Jamal was back at the library, poring over foreclosure law once more. And that's when he found it. Another crack in the bank's armor. The key to the case. The transfer of his mother's mortgage had changed hands 3 times, but the final transfer lacked a crucial endorsement. Without it, the bank had no legal standing to foreclose. It was a small technicality buried deep in legal jargon, something most people would overlook. But Jamal saw it for what it was, a lifeline. He filed another motion, this time challenging the bank's right to foreclose based on the missing endorsement. The next day, as Jamal exited the courthouse, Jonathan Sinclair was waiting for him on the steps, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Carter," Sinclair drawled, "I admire your persistence, really, I do. But you're wasting your time. We've already filed a motion to dismiss your latest nonsense." Jamal didn't flinch. "Funny thing about the law, Mr. Sinclair," he said, voice steady. "It doesn't care how many fancy suits you own. If you don't have standing, You don't have a case. For the first time, Sinclair's smile flickered, a crack in the bank's confidence. Jamal saw it. His fight was working, but the bank wasn't done retaliating. That evening, when Jamal returned to the community center, the director, Tom Brooks, was waiting for him. Arms crossed, expression tight. Jamal, Brooks sighed, avoiding eye contact. I hate to do this, but I have to let you go. Jamal blinked, stunned. What? Why? Brooks sighed again. We've had complaints. People saying you're bringing unwanted attention to the center. Donors are nervous. I can't afford to lose funding over this. Jamal's breath caught. They weren't just going after him. They were cutting off every avenue of survival, his job, his money, his home. They were trying to erase him entirely. By the time Jamal stumbled back to the motel, he was forced to sneak in through the side door since he couldn't pay for another night. He collapsed onto the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how much longer he could hold out. Was this fight even winnable? Or was he pushing against a system too powerful to break? Jamal Carter sat at the edge of his motel bed, the flickering neon light from the vacancy sign outside casting restless shadows across the room. He had lost his home, his job, his money, and now the bank was tightening the noose on anyone who tried to help him. On his lap, Linda's folder lay open, filled with damning evidence of First Union's corruption, forged signatures, falsified loan approvals, and memos openly targeting black home owners for foreclosure. It was powerful, but it wasn't enough. Jamal needed a witness, someone who could confirm the forgery, and Denise Fowler, the notary listed on the second mortgage, was his best shot. The next morning, Jamal drove 2 towns over in a borrowed car. Every mile stretched his nerves tighter. Denise's house was a modest 1-story home, its peeling white paint faded by the sun. A "Beware of Dog" sign hung loosely on the gate, though no dog was in sight. He knocked twice, his heart pounding. The door cracked open, and a middle-aged black woman with tired eyes peered out. "Ms. Fowler?" Jamal asked, holding up a copy of the notarized document. "I need to talk to you about this signature." Her eyes flicked to the paper and her face paled. "I can't help you," she muttered, starting to close the door. Jamal pressed his foot into the doorway. "Please," he urged. "This isn't just about me. They're stealing homes. Families are losing everything because of signatures like this." Denise hesitated, guilt flickering across her face. Finally, she sighed and stepped aside. The inside of her home was neat but sparse, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee. She gestured toward the couch, but Jamal remained standing. Then in a hushed voice, she admitted it. "I didn't witness that signature." Jamal stiffened. "What do you mean?" Denise exhaled shakily. "A banker brought me the papers, said the client was sick and couldn't come in. They told me it was just a formality. I stamped it without thinking." Jamal's heart pounded. "Do you realize what that means?" he asked, voice tight. "They used your notary stamp to forge a loan. That's fraud, perjury. It invalidates the entire foreclosure." Denise rubbed her temples, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "But if I testify, they'll come after me. My job, my house, everything." Jamal swallowed hard. He couldn't promise her safety, but he could promise the truth. If we don't fight this, they'll keep doing it. To more families, to more people like us. Denise wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. "I'll testify." With Denise's statement in hand, Jamal rushed to the courthouse. He filed an emergency motion to reopen the case based on newly discovered fraud. Judge Crawley, clearly irritated by Jamal's persistence, set a hearing for the following week. It wasn't immediate relief, but it was progress. However, the bank wasn't done playing dirty. 2 days later, Jamal woke to find his motel door ajar. The lock was busted. Inside, the room was ransacked, papers scattered, drawers overturned. His laptop was gone. His stomach dropped as he searched through the mess. Linda's folder was missing. Panic surged through him. He immediately called Linda. The line went straight to voicemail. Then he called Denise. "Ms. Fowler, are you okay?" he asked the moment she picked up. Her voice shook. "I'm fine, but 2 men came by my job, asking questions." Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly," she murmured. "But they knew I talked to you." Jamal cursed under his breath. The bank was tightening the noose. But instead of scaring him off, it only fueled his determination. Jamal spent the next few days preparing for the hearing, barely sleeping, surviving on gas station coffee and adrenaline. He combed through foreclosure statutes, memorized case law, and printed duplicate copies of every document they had tried to steal from him. He wasn't just fighting for his house anymore. He was fighting to expose the entire corrupt system. The day of the hearing arrived. The air was thick with tension as Jamal stepped into the courtroom. At the plaintiff's table, Jonathan Sinclair sat, his usual smugness replaced with something colder, more calculating. Judge Crawley barely glanced at Jamal as he took his seat. "Mr. Carter," Crawley drawled, flipping through the case file. "Back again, I see." Jamal met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." Sinclair rose from his seat, his voice oozing false confidence. "Your Honor, this case is a waste of the court's time. Mr. Carter is simply delaying the inevitable." Jamal stood. "Your Honor," he began, holding up the notarized mortgage document. "The signature on the second mortgage was forged, and I have the notary here to testify to that." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Sinclair's jaw tightened. Judge Crawley sat up straighter. "Proceed," he said. Denise stood, her voice trembling, but firm. "I notarized that document," she admitted, "but I didn't witness the signature. The bank told me it was just a formality." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jamal pressed forward. "That means the foreclosure was based on a fraudulent document. It's illegal." Sinclair's expression hardened. "Your Honor, we dispute this testimony." Crawley held up a hand, silencing him. For the first time, the judge looked unsettled. He rubbed his temples, leaning back in his chair. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "The court finds that sufficient evidence of fraud has been presented. The foreclosure is vacated." Silence. Then, shock. Jamal's breath hitched. He had won. He had beaten them. Sinclair's face was ashen, his jaw locked in fury. Crawley slammed his gavel down sharply. "This court is adjourned." Outside the courtroom, Jamal stood in the sunlight, stunned. For the first time in months, he breathed freely. Linda was waiting for him. She grinned. "You did it." Jamal exhaled. "We did it." But even as relief flooded through him, he knew this fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for the countless families who had been crushed by this system. And if the bank thought he was going to stop here, they had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick. Jamal Carter stood at the defendant's table, facing Jonathan Sinclair, the bank's lead attorney, who had just called his claims baseless. Jamal's voice cut through the silence. "Baseless?" He held up the notary affidavit signed by Denise Fowler. "This document proves the bank submitted a forged mortgage agreement. The notary herself confirmed she never witnessed the signature. That makes the foreclosure not just illegal, but criminal." Judge Robert Whitmore leaned forward for the first time, his gaze shifting to Sinclair. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge said slowly, "do you have an explanation for this?" Sinclair's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, we were unaware of any irregularities. We'll need time to verify these claims." Jamal stepped forward, his voice edged with fury. "Time? The bank has already evicted me, frozen my accounts, destroyed my credit, and harassed my witnesses. How much more time do they need to cover their tracks?" Judge Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temples. He hated being forced into a decision he didn't want to make. Finally, he muttered, "Fine. The court grants a temporary stay of foreclosure until this matter is investigated." Relief washed over Jamal. It wasn't a final victory, but it was the first real crack in the bank's armor. That night, back in his motel room, Jamal's phone buzzed in, an anonymous text. "You should have taken the settlement. This isn't over." Jamal stared at the screen, anger bubbling beneath his exhaustion. The bank was wounded, but a wounded predator was even more dangerous. And he knew they were coming for him next. 2 days later, Jamal walked into the courthouse to check the status of his discovery request. The clerk, a middle-aged white woman with tired eyes, glanced at her computer and frowned. "Your case has been flagged for procedural review," she said, typing furiously. "It's been removed from the active docket pending further evaluation." Jamal's heart sank. "What does that mean? The judge just granted the stay." The clerk shrugged. "Someone filed an emergency motion to reconsider. Until the judge reviews it, the stay is effectively paused." Jamal stepped back from the counter, blood pounding in his ears. Reconsideration, a legal loophole used to bury cases until the other side ran out of money or time, and Jamal was running out of both. His phone buzzed. Denise Fowler. Her voice shook. They froze my accounts. I can't access my paycheck. My landlord's already threatening eviction. Jamal cursed under his breath. Stay calm. They're trying to intimidate us. Well, it's working, Denise snapped. I'm losing everything because I helped you. Before he could respond, another call flashed across his screen. Unknown number. Jamal hesitated, then answered. Mr. Carter. Jonathan Sinclair's smooth, condescending voice filled the line. It seems you've stirred up quite the mess. I warned you this would happen. Jamal gritted his teeth. You're freezing accounts now? Harassing witnesses? That's witness tampering. Sinclair chuckled. Big words for a man sleeping in a motel. This isn't about the law anymore, Mr. Carter. It's about survival. Walk away, and maybe we'll stop squeezing. Jamal hung up. His fury boiled over. The bank wasn't just fighting his case. They were trying to destroy his life. By the time Jamal returned to the motel, the front desk clerk was waiting for him, arms crossed. Mr. Carter, your card was declined. You're behind 2 nights. I need payment by tomorrow morning, or you're out. Jamal didn't argue. What was the point? His account was frozen, his savings gone. That night, he slept in his car, parked in a dimly lit corner of the community center's lot. The irony wasn't lost on him. Fighting for a home while sleeping in the back seat of a borrowed car. The next morning, hunger gnawed at his stomach as he walked into the library. He bought a coffee with the last crumpled dollar in his pocket and settled into a corner table, flipping through the legal notes he had compiled. Then his phone buzzed again. Linda Ortiz. Call me, found something. Jamal dialed immediately. Linda answered on the first ring, her voice hushed. I got into the bank's internal system one last time before they revoked my access. Jamal's breath caught. What did you find? Emails between Sinclair, Klein, and even Judge Whitmore's assistant. Jamal's blood ran cold. Do you have the emails? I saved screenshots. Linda's voice was tense. But if I share them, I'm done, blacklisted from every firm in the state. Jamal exhaled slowly. I get it, but this isn't just about me anymore. Linda sighed. I'll send them, but be careful. They're playing for keeps. The screenshots arrived minutes later. Emails between Sinclair, Klein, and Judge Whitmore's assistant discussing how they had bypassed normal procedures to rush Jamal's foreclosure. It was blatant corruption, the kind that could blow the case wide open. But before Jamal could file the new evidence, the bank struck again. That afternoon, while Jamal was printing copies of the emails, his phone rang. Nia, her voice trembled. 2 investigators came to my job, asked my manager if I was involved in illegal activities. Jamal's grip tightened. What did your boss say? Said if I bring any more heat, I'm fired. Jamal closed his eyes. They weren't just targeting him anymore. They were going after everyone around him. By the time Jamal returned to the motel that evening, the lock on his room had been changed. The manager stood by the door, arms crossed. Can't let you back in without payment. Jamal didn't argue. Shouldering his backpack, he walked away. Homeless, broke, and now his evidence was worthless if he couldn't survive long enough to use it. That night, he sat in his car, staring at the courthouse in the distance. His mother had fought her whole life against a system designed to break her, and she had never given up. Neither would he. With shaking hands, Jamal opened his laptop. Using the free Wi-Fi from the diner across the street, he drafted a motion for an emergency hearing. He attached the emails from Linda, the affidavit from Denise, the timeline of every move the bank had made against him. Then he filed it electronically and sent copies to every local news outlet. Jamal Carter stood on the courthouse steps, gripping his worn folder of evidence, his knuckles white from the pressure. The sky above was heavy, gray, and unyielding, a mirror of the storm brewing inside the courtroom. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about power, about justice, and about survival. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing, despite the bailiff's half-hearted warnings. On the plaintiff's side, Jonathan Sinclair sat with his usual polished arrogance, but there was tension in his jaw, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Behind him, William Grant, the bank's regional director, whispered furiously to a junior associate. The bank had brought in reinforcements. Jamal didn't have reinforcements. Just Terrence Boyd from the Justice Collective, Denise Fowler, and his own determination. Judge Robert Whitmore sighed as he adjusted his robe, glancing at the packed courtroom. He wasn't happy about this. This is an emergency hearing regarding the foreclosure of 1210 Ridgeway Drive, he announced, his voice clipped. Mr. Carter, you may proceed. Jamal stood, his heart pounding. Your Honor, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. This foreclosure is based on fraudulent documents. The second mortgage my mother allegedly signed was notarized without her presence. The notary, Denise Fowler, is here to testify. Whitmore's eyes flickered with something, annoyance, fear, before he leaned back. Proceed. Denise stood, hands trembling as she took the oath. She glanced nervously at the bank's attorneys, then at Jamal. Under Boyd's questioning, she confirmed everything. I stamped the document without witnessing the signature, she admitted, her voice shaking. A bank representative told me it was a formality. I didn't realize I was authorizing a fraudulent mortgage. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sinclair shot to his feet. Objection, he snapped. This is hearsay and irrelevant to the foreclosure process. Jamal didn't wait for the judge's response. He stepped forward, holding up a printed email chain from Linda Ortiz's folder. Irrelevant? He shot back. These emails between Mr. Sinclair and William Grant show that they knew the documents were forged. They rushed my eviction anyway. They even discussed bypassing standard procedures to avoid scrutiny. Murmurs exploded through the gallery. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel, his face darkening. Order! But the damage was done. The courtroom wasn't just listening, they were watching. Boyd rose smoothly. Your Honor, we subpoenaed the bank's internal servers yesterday. The metadata confirms the authenticity of these emails. The court has a duty to investigate. Sinclair's face paled. He leaned toward Whitmore, whispering furiously. The judge's lips thinned, his jaw clenched. For a moment, Jamal thought he would dismiss the motion outright. Evidence be damned. Then something shifted. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Reporters typed furiously on their phones, sending out updates in real time. Whitmore's gaze swept the room, and Jamal saw the realization dawn in his eyes. This case was already bigger than the courtroom. It was public, unstoppable. With visible reluctance, Whitmore sighed and banged the gavel once more. The court will conduct a full review of the foreclosure process, including the authenticity of the mortgage documents. Until then, the foreclosure is stayed, and Mr. Carter retains possession of the property. Jamal's knees nearly buckled. He'd done it. He'd stopped the eviction. The crowd erupted, cameras flashing, voices buzzing with excitement, but the victory tasted hollow. As the crowd filtered out, Sinclair brushed past Jamal, his voice a low hiss. You think this is over? Jamal didn't flinch. So did you. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Boyd fielded questions while Jamal stood quietly, exhaustion finally crashing over him. Nia appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. You won, she murmured. At least for now. Jamal exhaled, his voice rough. They're not done. He glanced back at the courthouse. They'll come back harder. And they would. The bank had too much to lose. Whitmore had too many secrets to protect. Jamal had forced them into the light. But cornered animals were the most dangerous. Jamal Carter stood outside the courthouse, the crisp morning air biting through his thin jacket. The echoes of the last hearing still rang in his ears. Judge Whitmore's reluctant order for the bank to produce the original mortgage documents within 7 days. It had felt like a victory, but Jamal knew better. Cornered predators didn't retreat quietly. They lashed out, and the first blow landed just 2 days later. Jamal's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the court. Plaintiff has filed an emergency motion to dismiss the defendant's claims due to lack of merit. Attached was a lengthy legal document from Jonathan Sinclair. Jamal's pulse pounded as he scanned the pages. Sinclair argued that Jamal's fraud accusations were baseless, that the missing endorsement was merely a clerical oversight, that the foreclosure had been processed correctly and should proceed without further delay. Jamal tightened his grip on his phone, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. They weren't just playing defense. They were going for the kill. Jamal rushed back to the Justice Collective's office, nearly slamming into Terrence Boyd's desk as he dropped his phone in front of him. They're trying to dismiss the case before we even get the documents. Boyd picked up the phone, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed the filing. Damn. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. This isn't just a stalling tactic. They're trying to end this before it goes any further. Jamal's stomach twisted. Can they do that? Boyd nodded grimly. If the judge agrees, yes, but they're playing a dangerous game. If we can prove even a single instance of fraud, the whole case collapses. Jamal's mind raced. The email chain, the forged signature, Denise Fowler's notary confession. It was all there, but would it be enough? Boyd glanced up. We need to hit back, fast. We'll file a counter motion opposing dismissal, but Jamal, he hesitated. This is going to get ugly. Jamal set his jaw. Let it. That night, Jamal's phone rang again. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, then another call and another. Finally, on the fourth ring, he picked up. Mr. Carter. Jonathan Sinclair's voice was smooth, too smooth. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. Jamal gritted his teeth. Or what? Sinclair sighed dramatically, as if he were speaking to a misbehaving child. You don't want this fight. We've frozen your accounts. We've made sure no landlord will rent to you. You're living out of your car, aren't you? Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. You're running out of options, Mr. Carter. Jamal forced himself to stay calm. And you're running out of lies. Sinclair chuckled softly. You think you're winning? You don't even know what game you're playing. The line went dead. The next morning, Jamal stepped out of the laundromat bathroom where he had been washing up, only to find two police officers leaning against his car. Mr. Carter? Jamal stopped in his tracks. Yeah? One of the officers, a burly man with mirrored sunglasses, held up a clipboard. Your vehicle is being repossessed. You're behind on payments. Jamal's heart pounded. That's impossible. He took a step forward. I don't have a car loan. This car was paid for years ago. The officer shrugged. Take it up with the bank. The tow truck's engine roared to life. Jamal lunged forward, fists clenched, but stopped himself. This was deliberate. Planned, Sinclair had warned him, and now they were making good on their threats. The bank was sending a message. Keep fighting, and we'll take everything. By the time Jamal made it to the courthouse, his body was running on fumes. He didn't have a car. He didn't have a bank account. He didn't even have a place to sleep anymore. But he still had the truth. Inside, Boyd was already waiting. You okay? He asked, studying Jamal's exhausted face. Jamal exhaled sharply. No, but I don't have time to fall apart. Boyd handed him a stack of legal documents. We filed the opposition to dismissal. We'll know in an hour if the judge accepts it. Jamal nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The bank wasn't just trying to win in court. They were trying to break him. And if they couldn't silence him legally, they'd find another way. An hour later, Judge Whitmore entered the courtroom, face tight with irritation. He was tired of this case. Tired of Jamal's persistence. Tired of the bank's arrogance. Tired of all the attention it was getting. This court has reviewed both motions, Whitmore said, flipping through the files. He sighed, rubbing his temple. The plaintiff's request for dismissal is... Jamal held his breath. Denied. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore banged the gavel. The foreclosure remains on hold. The bank has 4 days left to produce the requested documents. Failure to do so will result in immediate dismissal of their foreclosure claim. Jamal's entire body sagged with relief. It wasn't a win, not yet, but it was a step closer. Sinclair, stone-faced, whispered something to William Grant, then stood. He turned to Jamal as he walked past. Enjoy your little victory. Jamal didn't blink. Enjoy your 4 days. Jamal Carter climbed the courthouse steps, his heart hammering in his chest. 10 days. That was all Judge Harrington had given him to prove malicious intent behind the fraudulent foreclosure. Without it, everything, his home, his fight, his months of relentless struggle, would collapse. And the bank knew it. For the past week, they had flooded Terrence Boyd's office with legal attacks, filing motions to delay counter-accusations of defamation. Endless procedural red tape, but they didn't stop there. Denise Fowler received an anonymous threat warning her to reconsider her testimony. Linda Ortiz, who had risked everything to leak the damning internal emails, found herself blacklisted from every major law firm in the state. It was happening exactly as Jamal had expected, but he still had one last move to make. The night before the hearing, Jamal sat in Boyd's office, his laptop open in front of him. On the screen, paused video footage from a bank conference room, timestamped 3 months earlier. A conversation between William Grant, Jonathan Sinclair, and Darren Klein, executives from First Union Bank. And the words captured on audio sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. If we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the signatures don't match, it won't matter. The court will side with us. We just have to keep pushing. Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was it, the final proof, an admission of intent. Linda had managed to retrieve the clip from a former IT employee who had quit the bank in disgust. Boyd, standing over his shoulder, let out a low whistle. Lambert is going to lose his damn mind when he sees this. Jamal nodded grimly. Good. The next morning, Jamal arrived at the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. Inside, the courtroom was packed. More reporters, more community activists, and more people who had been waiting for someone to fight back. At the plaintiff's table, Jonathan Sinclair sat stiffly, his usual calm arrogance replaced by something colder. Beside him, William Grant whispered furiously, while Darren Klein's face had gone pale. They knew. They knew what was coming. Judge Harrington entered, banging his gavel sharply. This court is now in session. We are here to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to prove malicious intent in the foreclosure of 1628 Pine Street. He glanced at Boyd. Mr. Boyd, you may proceed. Boyd stood smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he stepped forward. Your Honor, the plaintiff claims this foreclosure was a simple procedural matter, that any irregularities were mere clerical errors. But we now have proof that is not the case. He gestured to Jamal, who stood and carried a USB drive to the court clerk. This is surveillance footage from First Union Bank's internal meetings, in which high-ranking executives discuss how to manipulate foreclosure proceedings to bypass legal scrutiny. Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed. Play the footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video began. The grainy footage flickered on the screen. Darren Klein's voice came through clearly. If we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the signatures don't match, it won't matter. The court will side with us. We just have to keep pushing. Jonathan Sinclair nodded in agreement. We'll get the property no matter what. Even if someone fights back, by the time they get through the system, we'll have already liquidated the assets. The video ended. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. Then Judge Harrington turned to Sinclair, his expression unreadable. Mr. Sinclair, does First Union Bank have an explanation for this? Sinclair stood slowly, jaw clenched. Your Honor, this footage is taken out of context. Out of context? Boyd cut in sharply. Are you saying your own executives were misquoted? Because we can play it again. Sinclair's face tightened. Klein looked ready to pass out. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Judge Harrington sighed, rubbing his temple. I've heard enough. He turned to Jamal. Mr. Carter, this court finds sufficient evidence of intentional fraud and malicious foreclosure practices. The foreclosure claim is dismissed. Furthermore, this court orders a full investigation into First Union Bank's foreclosure policies. This case is now referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. Court adjourned. The gavel banged. The room exploded. Jamal sagged into his seat, barely able to process it. He'd won. Not just the house, not just his mother's legacy, but justice. Naya rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him. You did it. Denise Fowler wiped tears from her eyes. Linda nodded in silent relief. But as Jamal looked toward the plaintiff's table, he saw something chilling. Sinclair and Klein weren't angry. They were calculating. This wasn't over. It had just changed. Boyd clapped him on the shoulder. You won the battle, Jamal, but the war. Jamal nodded, his hands still trembling. The war's just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras poised for what had become the biggest foreclosure scandal the city had seen in years. At the plaintiff's table, Jonathan Sinclair sat stiffly, his usual smugness gone. Beside him, William Grant, the regional manager of First Union Bank, looked pale and drawn. They knew something was coming. Judge Harrington entered, banging his gavel sharply. "Mr. Carter, this is your final opportunity to provide evidence of intent. Proceed." Jamal Carter stood, holding up a flash drive. "Your Honor, I have obtained video evidence from an internal meeting at First Union Bank. In this recording, bank officials discuss a deliberate strategy to push through fraudulent foreclosures before homeowners can challenge them in court." Sinclair shot up from his seat. "Objection! This evidence was obtained illegally and should be inadmissible." Boyd didn't even blink. "Your Honor, the whistleblower who provided this footage has sworn an affidavit confirming its authenticity. The bank cannot claim privacy protection while engaging in fraudulent activity." Judge Harrington sighed, rubbing his temple. "Play the footage." The courtroom fell silent as the screen flickered to life. The grainy footage played, and Darren Klein's voice filled the room with damning clarity. "If we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the signatures don't match, it won't matter. The court will side with them. We just have to keep pushing." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. Sinclair's face drained of color. Grant's fist clenched at his sides. Judge Harrington sat motionless for a moment, then turned to Sinclair with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Sinclair, does your client have an explanation for this?" Sinclair cleared his throat, his voice suddenly less certain. "Your Honor, these statements are taken out of context." "They're crystal clear," Boyd interrupted sharply. "The bank knowingly pushed fraudulent foreclosures through the system, expecting the courts to rubber stamp them. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a strategy." Judge Harrington exhaled heavily, fingers tapping against the bench. For the first time, he looked at Jamal differently. Not with skepticism, not with condescension, with respect. "This court finds sufficient evidence to support claims of malicious foreclosure fraud. The foreclosure of Mr. Carter's home is officially nullified." A wave of relief crashed over Jamal. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of it settle. He had done it. He had won. But Judge Harrington wasn't finished. "This court also orders an immediate independent investigation into First Union Bank's foreclosure practices. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the State Bar Association for potential ethical violations by Mr. Sinclair." Sinclair's face twisted in shock. Klein, still frozen in his seat, looked as if he might be sick. "Court adjourned." Judge Harrington banged the gavel. The room exploded into motion. Reporters rushed toward Jamal, cameras flashing. Boyd clapped him on the back, grinning. "You didn't just win your case, Jamal. You blew the whole thing open." Naya appeared beside him, grabbing his hand. "You did it," she whispered, squeezing tightly. But Jamal knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The bank wouldn't go down quietly. And people like Sinclair didn't accept defeat easily. That evening, Jamal stood outside his mother's house. The house that had nearly been stolen from him. The house that had been in his family for generations. The eviction notice was gone, replaced by the original deed, freshly stamped by the courthouse. He ran his fingers over his mother's name. Tears prickled at the corners of his eyes. Inside, the rooms were empty, but full of memories. The worn couch where his mother had watched her favorite soap operas. The kitchen table, scratched from years of family dinners and late-night homework sessions. The faded wallpaper in the hallway peeling at the corners, but stubbornly clinging on. Just like him. Knock, knock, Jamal turned. Boyd stood at the door holding a thick manila envelope. "Settlement offer," Boyd said, handing it over. "First Union's legal team wants to avoid a full-scale investigation. They're offering a cash payout if you agree to drop the civil claims." Jamal opened the envelope. His eyes widened at the figure inside. 6 figures, enough to rebuild his life, enough to start fresh. But as he flipped through the pages, his gaze caught one line buried deep in the fine print. "Acceptance of this settlement constitutes full release of claims against First Union Bank, its subsidiaries, and associated parties." A gag order. They weren't just trying to buy him off, they were trying to silence him. Jamal looked up at Boyd, jaw tightening. "If I sign this, the investigation dies." "They get away with it." Boyd nodded slowly. "It's your call, Jamal." No one would blame you for taking the money and walking away. You've already won. Jamal held the envelope for a long moment. Winning back his house was personal, but justice, that was bigger than him. He handed the envelope back. Tell them to shove it. I'm not for sale. Boyd's smile returned, wider this time. I figured you'd say that. The video evidence went viral. State investigators raided First Union's regional offices. Darren Klein resigned under pressure. Jonathan Sinclair was suspended, pending a Bar Association ethics review. Judge Harrington's financial ties to the bank were exposed in a separate whistleblower report. But for Jamal, the real victory came quietly. One evening, as he sat on his porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, a middle-aged black woman approached. Her teenage son trailed behind her. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, hesitant but hopeful. "I just wanted to say thank you. My sister was about to lose her house, same bank, same forged documents. Because of your case, they dropped the foreclosure. She kept her home." Jamal smiled warmly. "That's why we fight." As the sun set behind the house that once seemed lost forever, Jamal knew the system would regroup. The fight wasn't really over, but now people were watching. And Jamal Carter, he was just getting started. Jamal Carter's story is more than just a legal battle over a house. It's a powerful reminder that the system is not designed to protect the powerless. Instead, it favors those with wealth, influence, and connections. The bank counted on Jamal being uninformed, on him accepting their lies without question, and on him giving up before he could expose their corruption. But Jamal refused to be another victim. His fight teaches us an invaluable lesson. Knowledge is power, and justice only exists when people are willing to demand it. One of the biggest takeaways from Jamal's story is the importance of knowing your rights. Too often, people sign documents without fully understanding them, trusting that the system will be fair. But as Jamal learned, corporations do not operate on fairness, they operate on profit. If he hadn't questioned the discrepancies in his mother's mortgage documents, the fraud would have gone unnoticed. His case proves that blind trust in the system is dangerous. Laws are written in complicated language to discourage ordinary people from fighting back. But once Jamal took the time to educate himself, studying foreclosure laws, cross-referencing legal documents, and reaching out to experts, he found the cracks in their lies. His story shows that the first step to justice is understanding how the system works and how it can be manipulated against you. Another crucial lesson from Jamal's battle is the power of unity and community. He did not win this fight alone. Denise Fowler, the notary who admitted the signature was forged, Linda Ortiz, the whistleblower who leaked internal bank memos, and the Justice Collective, the legal team that helped him fight back, all played key roles in exposing First Union Bank. Their willingness to stand up against corruption, despite the risks, was what ultimately brought the truth to light. This highlights a harsh reality. Corrupt systems survive by keeping people isolated, by making them feel like they have no choice but to accept injustice. Jamal's story shows that real change happens when people unite, share information, and hold institutions accountable. But perhaps the most important takeaway from Jamal's fight is this: justice is not automatic. It does not come freely, nor is it handed down by those in power. Justice must be fought for, and that fight is often long, exhausting, and costly. Jamal lost his job, his savings, and nearly everything he had. He was harassed, threatened, and intimidated. He could have taken the easy way out, accepted the settlement, walked away, and let the bank continue preying on other families. But he didn't. He understood that his case was bigger than himself. By refusing to be silenced, he set a precedent, one that forced an entire institution to answer for its corruption. At its core, Jamal Carter's story teaches us that justice is not won by those who have the most money or the best lawyers. It is won by those who refuse to back down, no matter the odds. The system thrives on fear and exhaustion. But when people push back, when they fight with knowledge, strategy, and unity, they force the system to change. And that is the true lesson of this fight. Power doesn't belong to the corrupt. It belongs to those who dare to challenge them. If you believe fighting corruption is always worth it, no matter the cost, comment, "Justice must win" below. Like this video if you stand with Jamal Carter in his fight against a broken system. Share this story to spread awareness, because knowledge is power. Comment your thoughts. Should Jamal have taken the settlement, or was he right to keep fighting? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next powerful story about standing up for what's right. The fight for justice isn't over, and stories like this prove that when people refuse to back down, real change happens. Are you ready to be part of the movement? Let's make our voices heard.